Are you planning to engage in a debate with historians who have spoken against your views?
There is a fundamental difference between our position and the position of supporters of traditional chronology. We do not claim to know the truth. We believe that the truth can be found through a very difficult and painstaking process, a process that may not necessarily lead to a specific result that satisfies everyone or sets the record straight. Most likely, we will never know the entire truth, but that does not mean we should stop the process of searching.
There is a belief that perfect crimes do not exist. This is what a first-year student at our university asks. Since a criminal cannot destroy all the evidence, do you really think that, in the midst of widespread document forgery, the organizers could take into account all sources, including private ones? You still have not substantiated how it is physically possible to forge a huge number of ancient documents, different in content and in writing.
In reality, there are far fewer of them than you might think, but this work didn't take just a couple of years. In different countries, including Russia, this process was very active from the late 16th century until the late 18th century. In Russia, it concluded in the early 19th century with the publication of Karamzin's work. Many sources from the 17th and 18th centuries provide us with truthful information. In reality, there are very few genuine sources that can help us piece together the picture. And I repeat, in 200 years, one can do anything they want. I spoke about this during my presentation at the University of the Humanities Sciences. In the 20th century, with radio, telegraph, and other means of communication, Stalin needed just 20 years to write the short course of the history of the All-Union Communist Party, which completely distorted the history of the October coup. By the way, if we didn't have ability to access parallel information from abroad, we would still be studying history based on the short course. Therefore, distorting history is much easier than you may imagine.
You rely on certain sources, for example, from the time of the Romanovs and the Pugachev rebellion, while rejecting the accuracy of sources from more ancient epics. Isn't there a certain logical vicious circle here? And perhaps it's worth considering that all sources from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries are forged, say, during the time of Stalin, as Garry Kasparov mentioned. Maybe they have been falsified by the last generation of historians in the last 50 years?
The fundamental difference between sources from the 17th and 18th centuries and those from earlier epochs is that for the first time, we have the opportunity to compare different sources. The so-called Pugachev's rebellion is known not only from documents that exist in Russia. For example, there is correspondence between Voltaire and Catherine the Great, in which she refers to Pugachev as Monsieur Pugachev. So, in principle, documents from the 18th century allow for a kind of cross-examination, where we can question and compare whether these documents are authentic. Unfortunately, such an opportunity is absent before the 17th century because most authentic documents, from our perspective, were ruthlessly eliminated.
There are cases where archaeological material does not initially match and, moreover, contradicts the data from written sources. But, as a rule, through traditional source studies, these contradictions can be fairly easily resolved. This takes time and a certain mastery of the historian's craft, nothing more.
Bravo! Gary Kimovich, I feel that you also want to respond. Please go ahead.
Indeed, it requires mastery of certain craft, the skill of a historian, archaeologist, and so on. Because very often, for example, data from the natural sciences, which our opponents speak of with such disdain, simply do not correspond to data from radiocarbon dating, C14, or chemical analysis. Unfortunately, Yaroslav Arkadievich did not explain in full that certain work could not have been done before the invention of certain chemical reagents. It just couldn't have appeared. There are natural sciences. And yet, I would very much like historians to stop retreating into their shell and start using arguments from the natural sciences to support their views, instead of saying that they will be brought into line with source data. Good afternoon. Unfortunately, the terms of my debate have placed quite strict limitations on me. Alexander Sergeyevich has given me little time, but we will manage within it. So I had to leave out the maps that I wanted to present as evidence for the words and ideas that I intend to express here. Just one comment, because I must naturally base my remarks on the presentation of the previous speaker, one of our respected opponents, Mr. Vorogov. He passionately defended the official point of view and stated that it is impossible to falsify the documents of an entire country. In general, the term falsify is a loose concept. Obviously, it is difficult to copy what existed in the 11th century. But if you have burned everything that came before that, then there will be exactly what you need. There will simply be nothing to compare with. I pondered for a long time about which example from Russian history to provide because there is quite a broad range of different situations that in our view would prove our correctness and demonstrate the illegitimacy of the official Scaligerian chronology. But I thought that it would probably be wrong to delve into the lore of ages long gone by, in deep antiquity compounded. This, I believe, can obscure the essence of the problem. In reality, we need to understand, if such falsification occurred, why it was done and for whom. Why the Romanovs falsified Russian history can be explained in simple terms using one specific example. Unfortunately, I will not talk about falsifications in Western Europe, as they were connected. So, why did the Romanovs falsify the history? I will provide one specific example. For this, I would like to remind everyone of the famous phrase, "I'm afraid of getting it wrong," from the father of political historiography, Niccolò Machiavelli, who clearly bequeathed to his descendants, naturally, to rulers, that history is written so that it is easier for the ruler to govern the subjects. So, who controls the past controls the future. Why did the Romanovs falsify history? Because the Romanov dynasty was illegitimate. It seized the throne as a result of a severe civil war. And the most interesting part is that this civil war did not end in 1610 or 1613. It ended much later, specifically at the end of the 18th century. And through an example that everyone is familiar with from their school days, from books, from Russian classics, I will try to show you how Russian history not of the 12th, 13th, or 16th, not even of the 17th century was falsified. I will speak about events at the end of the 18th century. By the way, what happened in Russia at the end of the 18th century? Well, probably, everyone knows, as we study it in literature and history. Yes, it was the peasant war led by the thief and bandit Yemelyan Pugachev. Everyone knows about it. Even those who haven't read a history textbook have at least read The Captain's Daughter. Fewer people have read The History of Pugachev, also written by Alexander Pushkin. By the way, a very small but important detail. Between the lines, and sometimes directly in the text, Alexander Pushkin repeatedly complained that they didn't allow him to access the archives. We know that by the highest order, the censor for Pushkin was none other than Tsar Nicholas I himself. The court poet, a fairly loyal subject, who wrote the famous history, a famous page of Russian history, was not allowed to access the archives. Why? Let's just briefly recall what happened in this war. Gangs of bandits, Yaik Cossacks, gathered somewhere in the Orenburg steppes. Some thief and bandit, almost a branded criminal who had served time in prison, came to them, declared himself Tsar Peter III, and the war began. Well, not a war, of course, but a rebellion. Bandits burned villages, tried to capture Orenburg. Naturally, near Orenburg, they met with failure. What else could be expected? How can an inexperienced gang, even if it consists of tens of thousands of common people, fight against a regular army? To help you understand the difference between a regular army at that time and individual detachments, I will give an example from parallel history. Almost in the same years, the American War of Independence began. After all, there is an ocean between England and America, and the supply of soldiers and all the logistics were quite difficult. The English did not fight against some mob, not against the common people, not against peasants. They fought against American settlers who had carried weapons since childhood. Carrying weapons was practically mandatory for them because of the places they lived in. The American army was commanded by senior officers of the English army, with George Washington at the helm. Nevertheless, for 5 years, the American army suffered defeat, and Washington regularly complained that it was difficult to create an army from an unorganized militia. If it weren't for the help of the French fleet, which practically cut off communication lines, and in the end, an expedition led by de Rochambeau landed on American soil, it is unclear how that war would have ended. So, the regular army was much stronger. As for Russia, what happened? A gang of bandits, probably armed with little more than pitchforks. Next, we find some strange things. After being completely defeated near Orenburg, what do these rebels, what does this gang of bandits do? Well, they could have fled into the Orenburg steppe, into Kazakhstan, or even to the Caspian Sea. They move up the Volga, win a series of battles, and capture Kazan. As we were informed, the regular army essentially goes against them. Well, naturally, they suffer a complete defeat near Kazan. And here, instead of fleeing headlong with a handful of loyal followers, this rebel crosses the Volga, reaches its western bank, and starts moving towards Moscow. In general, it is clear that common sense cannot explain these events. By the way, it is said that even Alexander Suvorov arrived, apparently to complete the defeat of these bands. Now, let's talk seriously about what was happening at that time. Of course, it's ridiculous to talk about a war with rebels. I remind you that in 1774, Russia interrupted a successful war with Turkey when Turkey was exhausted, and the prospect of a campaign to Constantinople was opening up, which was the golden dream of Catherine the Great. For this, her grandson was named Constantine. This shows how she felt about it. Constantine was supposed to rule there. Russian troops had a real chance to reach the shores of the Bosphorus and threaten Constantinople. The war was interrupted, and a favorable peace was concluded for Russia, but at that moment, Russia could have aspired to much more. Military units were urgently withdrawn from the front. As historian Savelyev writes in 1915 in his book, Ancient History of the Cossacks, that 14 Don Cossacks regiments, which were a strike force, were urgently transferred to the Eastern Front. 14 regiments of Don Cossacks were a tremendous force. Mother of the Fatherland said that she herself should have led the army. Against whom? Against a gang of bandits who had already been defeated a couple of times near Kazan? Alexander Suvorov personally leads the army and arrives at the scene to help the generals and local leaders fight this spreading plague. Count Panin, one of Catherine's closest confidants, also goes to the scene to boost the morale of the local administration. What does Alexander Pushkin write? The clergy, including its highest ranks, switched sides to support the pretender. What can you say about commoners? Cossacks were defecting in groups, including select squadrons of Don Cossacks who had just fought in the war against Turkey. According to the testimony of Pushkin himself, who collected the information available at the time, in just one battle near Tsaritsyn, more than 1,000 Don Cossacks switched sides. Whose side did they switch to? The side of the pretender? A thief? Maybe it's time to stop fooling ourselves? Perhaps it's time to acknowledge that this was not a rebellion, but a real war. A war of the Romanov Russia, the final stage, against an enormous country, the world's largest at the time, which was then called Moscow Tartary, the remnants of the vast Horde Empire. Furthermore, we find independent evidence of this. I repeat, that unfortunately I can't show you a map. The British Encyclopedia, published in 1768, relied on mid-18th century sources, and it asserts that before the so-called Pugachev's rebellion, there existed the Russian Empire. Apparently, the English were not very literate people, but for some reason, they believed that there were also states. Moscow Tartary with its capital in Tobolsk, independent Tartary with its capital in Samarkand, and even Chinese Tartary. French maps simply show Great Tartary, without making distinctions between them. Thus, there was a vast empire. And then everything becomes clear. It becomes clear why almost the entire cream of the Russian army was urgently transferred to the Eastern Front. It's clear why the Cossacks, common people, and the clergy, especially the old believers who considered Pugachev and his movement as representatives of the legitimate dynasty, changed their allegiance. By the way, notice the nicknames the Romanovs assigned to the so-called false Dmitry, who from our point of view was the legitimate horde czar, Otrepiev, meaning garbage, lees of society, and Pugachev, Pugach, meaning scarecrow. It is perfectly clear that it was not about real leaders but rather about some names that the Romanovs had to attribute to their opponents in order to completely belittle the significance of these events. Nevertheless, following the suppression of Pugachev's rebellion, or more precisely, at the end of the war, by the order of the highest Senate, the Romanovs permanently sealed all documents related to this period. I emphasize again, even after 50 years, even after 60 years, Alexander Pushkin was unable to gain access to them. This is also a significant detail. So, everything was over, they were defeated. By the way, Pushkin reports, Suvorov and Panin spent another year restoring order in these regions. What? Alexander Suvorov was chasing gangs in the woods, wasn't he? Or perhaps it was something else entirely. that the war shifted from the territory of Romanov Russia to the territory of Moscow Tartary, and Suvorov was more likely leading an advance towards Tobolsk and capturing that city? The important thing is that all this is on the maps. Again, I'm unable to approach the projector due to time constraints, but I have everything with me here. In 1794, all of this disappears, and Moscow Tartary vanishes. Europeans gain access to North America for the first time and provide a complete map of the entire northwestern United States. So, the whole map is completely filled in, there are no more gaps on maps. In Russia, the history of Siberia is immediately published, and new governorates appear. By the way, history tells us that they became very large. Well, of course, they became large because they had to digest an absolutely gigantic territory. By the way, after this war, exiles to Tobolsk began. Before that, for some reason, they were exiled to the north, to Solovki. Nobody was exiled to Siberia because they simply couldn't do it. I deliberately brought up this example. There's a lot to say about this. As you understand, the war with Razin was one of the stages of this gigantic war. The war that began with the accession to the Russian throne of the pro-German Romanov dynasty. The war that was part of the total change of dynastic lines throughout Europe. Notice that in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, reigning dynasties changed in all major European countries. The dynasty that was closely linked to the old Horde dynasty would go away, and new dynasties would come in. By the way, Scaliger worked directly for Henry of Bourbon, who was also an usurper like the Romanovs, and who had a vested interest in falsifying his rights to the throne. Since, how could a shabby Navarrese boyar, with no legitimate claims to the throne, suddenly seize it? Naturally, it needed justification. In Europe, this process ended much earlier, but it can be discussed separately. I believe it concluded by the late 17th century. In Russia, due to the Horde's significant military power, it took much longer. But it's crucial to note that falsification, manipulation of facts, and the complete disregard of sources, including foreign ones, were observed in 18th century Russia. So, there's no need to look too far. We must understand whether the Romanovs had an interest in falsifying Russian history. We assert that they did. It was a political war that lasted for almost 200 years. They had no other way out. And we know very well that in the 20th century, these techniques were exploited as well. By the way, there's a little-known fact that they try not to publicize. When the Bourbons finally returned to France in 1815, they attempted to write a school textbook without Napoleon. Well, there was no Napoleon. At that time, the Bourbons issued orders that removed European wars. Obviously, the attempt failed. In the 19th century, there were many parallel sources, and France, in general, wasn't like Tobolsk. It was difficult to hide the truth, as Napoleon's troops marched all over Europe. But the fact that such a feeble attempt was made indicates that it wasn't an unthinkable idea. The falsification of history had become commonplace. Therefore, when contemplating our history, looking back, we must primarily compare sources. We cannot simply take for granted, just buy the truth that is presented to us in books, as I have just told you, about the so-called Peasant War. I reiterate, there are many very interesting sources. I will mention one thing. Unfortunately, I cannot show it on a map, but again, when the question period comes, perhaps I will have such a moment. There is one very interesting nuance. On Western European maps from the second half of the 18th century, which are very well made, part of which is presented in the books of Fomenko and Nosovsky, you can see how the vast expanses of our homeland, Russia, are described in great detail. There are many cities. Vologda, Vladimir, Ryazan, even Tiflis appears, Sevastopol, of course, Tobolsk, Arkhangelsk, the city of Pskov under its old name Pleskov, Belgorod, Poltava. Everything is on the maps, and the cities are very accurately indicated. But there is one city that is missing from these maps. It is the city of Novgorod. More precisely, it is there, but Novgorod is called Novgorod-Seversky, which is located between Belgorod and Poltava, south of Moscow. Therefore, it's very astonishing that according to the official Russian Romanov-Skaligerian version, Novgorod was the first commercial city that traded with Europe. It is precisely this city that Europeans should have known about first and foremost. Unfortunately, they didn't know about the existence of such a city. They indicated much smaller cities, but Novgorod was absent. The Romanovs hadn't yet informed them about the appearance of the cradle of Russian cities, from where the light of knowledge apparently spread. This repeats one of the numerous examples of how multiple sources are simply and consciously ignored. The sources are not from the 12th–13th centuries, and I don't want to enter that debate right now, though we could say a lot about it. The sources are from the 18th century, and it's a conscious effort to eliminate the entire bibliography. You can endlessly ask these questions about the facts of Russian history and foreign history. All the real bibliography that could shed light on these events is consciously ignored by historians. And instead, we are told, read the history textbook, take the parchment, take this or that. It's a repetition of what we've talked about, what we've warned about. Arguments in support of the old Scaligerian chronology are pulled out of it itself. Language develops over 1,000 years. Well, pardon me, this is not an argument because you need to prove the correctness of the chronology, and this is made into an argument from the same system, which means it doesn't exist outside of it. I repeat, we have very little time, I must finish. I don't usually lose on time. Thank you. Until you answer why the English in the 18th century believed there was no unified Russian Empire, you have no right to tell students about the peasant uprising of Pugachev. You need to answer this question. If you want to believe that all the might of Russian weaponry was thrown against a gang of marauders led by the bandit Pugachev, that's your right. I'm proud to belong to common knowledge. I'm proud that we make history accessible to everyone. From a dead science that belongs to people who defend the honor of a uniform. We want to make it accessible to all, so that students ask questions, so that they get answers, and so that we have the opportunity to analyze our own history, rather than read and repeat like a parrot when the Battle of Marathon took place, when such and such an event happened, and Pugachev was a rootless bandit. Thank you.